Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. This one's going to be on formations. A couple of you in the comments have asked, why not this formation, why not this one? This will be a quick little video of me discussing every formation, and the reasons why I only look to use actually 2 or 3 different ones in game. Now the 4-3-3-4, the last video I released, was extremely confident it would work, and it did not. I had a just awful weekend league performance. So the next video after this one is going to be me trying to be accountable with that, talking about the formation and why it didn't work. But this one, I just want to put out a quick idea over what formations I actually like using, which players they allow me to use, and kind of why I look for these specific systems. So, now I've already talked a lot about my 4-3-3 holding, but I want to discuss a little bit more about it. To think about it this way, it allows me to use more attacking players than any other formation I've really found, because all of these players can be close-ish to dedicated attackers. These two obviously have to be somewhat defensive. But then we get these two involved as well that are also really attacking focused. So when you use a formation like this, these don't have to be well-rounded box-to-box players necessarily. You want them, at least 70 defending maybe, but they don't have to be 80 or 90. These don't need to be defensive focused players. They don't need to be Sissoko or Hullet or anything. These can be Odegaards or Musialas maybe. You don't want them as Dybalas, obviously, with like 40 defending. But they can be pretty attack-focused, because the formation, for me, is defensively solid enough where just this block here can defend well enough and maintain a good enough shape, where you don't necessarily need great playstyles or defending stats on them. You can just kind of use these players to corral them into your other better defenders. These ones, obviously, you want to have your pretty well-rounded, maybe 80 plus in all stats players. They don't necessarily need to shoot, but you want them good at everything else. But then these ones, can be dedicated, these ones can be dedicated attackers that are all, your Neymars and Messis and all of that. Now, a formation like a 4-2-3-1, you might think allows you to use more attackers. These can all be Messi and Dybala, whereas in the other one, you want at least a center mid here, so maybe you're losing one, more fully dedicated attacker. But the downside is you have to use much more defensively focused CDMs. So these need to be kind of your Sissokos and 80 plus defenders, whereas it allows me still like this to include, I think, more attackers. Maybe not as high quality attackers in every situation, but very well-rounded attackers and more players focused on offense rather than a couple more dedicated just to the defensive side. So if we invert this to that 4-2-3-1 or the 4-3-3-4 that I was using, from your Odegaards and all of that into this shape, you kind of need these players to start being more defensively focused like that CDM was. So I think I was trying to use perhaps 2 aggressive or 2 attacking players here, whereas you might need just more of a physical presence or some better playstyles in these situations rather than just kind of, both of my players did have 80 defending, but they were significantly shorter. So I think just having to cover much more distances and perform some of the physical actions you might expect of your CDM, or you might expect to kind of mitigate by having more of a defensive partnership here. By lacking that and moving a player upfield, I think I was just missing in the midfield game quite a lot this weekend. Now, the reason I want a formation like this instead of one that looks exactly the same at the very end, but different as it starts, is the problem with a narrow formation is it allows your opponent's defenders to condense up significantly. So their shape can be much more central. They're only guarding these threats here. Obviously, you can have your overlapping fullbacks and create a similar shape as the 4-3-3 holding that I normally use, but it's still, because it allows the opponent's defense to condense up a little bit quicker, it allows them to extend kind of out and defend you from here if those situations arise, rather than starting from wide and having more gaps immediately open. So as we move them down the field, the idea is to build up any structure that eventually looks to be significantly wider than a lot of other formations would encourage the defense to be. So we have these players starting here, and then they will eventually drift wide and force the opponent's defense to condense, but from a wider position, and that should allow for more gaps, rather than attacking like this by default, and just allowing your opponent's defense to make this shape. So all we're looking to do is turn them, instead of allowing, a shape like this, you just want them that little bit wider so there's a little bit more of a gap that you can dribble into here. Another thing this formation would allow for pretty well, theoretically at least, were the attacking AI better, but excuse me, is it's not just forcing them to stretch this way, but it also stretches them out this way. Because you've got players that are a little bit more likely to hold back just a little bit or make some deeper runs, it's just trying to force these players out a little bit. You know, if you have the ball with your 6 here, then it can encourage these players to step out. Maybe you get the midfielder stepping up just to cover some of the gaps when the attackers move forward. Now you've got a little bit of a gap here to operate in, rather than encouraging your opponent to get as condensed, as turtled up as possible, and then trying to work through these spaces. I think my 4-3-3-4, which was instead more, I suppose, that shape, is it never really encouraged the opponent to step out of this shape. So there was no movement for them here. All of my movement was trying to get the ball out wide, getting to a fullback, and then just trying like this kind of option the whole time, and trying to score through there. Just stretching them out wide. But whenever I had the ball with the, it's more like, what am I missing? This shape, excuse me. Whenever I had the ball here with the center mids, they really had no threat. There wasn't much reason for the opponent to step out to them and create any gaps for me. Obviously, if they did, then I'd have some pretty good attacking opportunities. But most defenders, especially in, when you're playing a really competitive weekend league, are pretty good at maintaining their shape here. And there was just no encouragement for them to come step out here. These players weren't connected well enough. There's just not enough passing options. Everyone's kind of covered by default. So there was no danger in them stepping up here. There's no reason to encourage them to step out of their shape by default. When you have that little bit of a pivot, well, maybe you don't want to afford this guy that much space. It allows some better runs to be made off the ball sometimes. And now they're having to step significantly further to get out to you. Again, all we're looking to do is turn them from like 5 yards of space here into 8-10 yards of space. Open these little pockets up. Now that's going to encourage this guy to step up. Maybe that encourages this guy to step up. Now we've got some gaps to operate in. Another benefit is when you're holding the ball deeper, it allows you to look forward on the field and have all of your passing options ahead of you. When the ball's here, you don't actually have any passing options ahead of you. Everything's to the side, or you have to do a really creative, pass like that and hope that you've got the space for that to work. When you get the ball up here, you're kind of looking dribble, or maybe I get that pass to the side, but everything else is back. When you're actually holding the ball with your midfielders more, you're attack focused, you're on the front foot, always looking forward. It's like, okay, I can look for these gaps, I can hope these runs are being made and have this little bit of creativity here. When everything you're doing is more focused on getting as forward as possible, well, now you don't really have these passing lanes. It's normally going to be more condensed. Everyone's just crowding up the same space. Your own players are kind of running into the same lanes, so especially with Shadow Striker in this guy, he would end up like this, and you end up in a 4-2-4 shape with your attackers, which means everyone's in the same flat line. I've got no depth, no creativity to get passing lanes off here, because this guy's going to be covered, or sometimes he's blocked by one of my own players, and then you're just not able to get here. And again, we're not really able to have them step out and cover my midfielders, because there's just no danger there. What's this guy going to do? He's going to dribble into a space that's already occupied by 3 of my other attackers, and I have to run through here, and then leave just such a massive gap for the counterattack. When you've got your more dedicated player to guard the counterattacks, I think it also allows your center backs to cover the wings a little bit better. When you're missing that, I thought I would have more defenders overall be able to get back and stem counterattacks, but the shape was just so poor as it was that I didn't really have any ability to prevent them from getting down the wing and then just having a massive gap in the center instead. So I think even though it on paper looks like a more defensive formation, I think I may be returning to the 4-3-3 holding and trying to just some different roles or, tactics in game to open up something else. I may have to take out the attacking wingbacks because by having so many attackers, it forces the defense to get a little bit further back, a little bit more compact. I think sometimes if you attack with less players, you might actually have more space, more runs being made up here. They might actually stay a little bit further up the field or maybe a little wider just kind of by default. They're not turtling up as much. They don't feel as threatened. Sometimes if you're holding the ball back here, it's the same idea. Maybe you can stretch them out this way. And now even though you've got way less attackers you're playing with, the defense is still way more open, which is a really silly idea. This is not how things should be coded. I should be rewarded for having so many attackers. I'm fine with succeeding in counterattacks. Like that's fine with me. Or, I'm fine with being counterattacked pretty frequently. It does not bother me. I would accept that. But the really frustrating thing is the more attackers I have, I think the less success on offense you have, which is just wild. Like, again, this game is coded really poorly, but the idea is to have a formation like this, which both stretches them wide this way, but also has some threat when I get the ball back here to encourage them out this way, which opens up some space for some creative runs to be made and all of that. As I used the 4-3-3-4, I don't think I had that threat from deep, the ability to pull them out this way, which means I was forced only wide in every situation and trying to do something back here. Now, we're going to get into my quick thoughts on every formation here, but as a quick primer, the reason I don't like a lot of two-striker formations, and we'll just kind of discard them immediately, is when's the last time you've actually seen a genuine two-striker formation? You might think Griezmann and Morata at like Atletico Madrid, or maybe Gabriel Jesus and Havertz have been used that way or something. Like you get it occasionally, but even in those situations, Jesus and Havertz aren't your standard strikers. Griezmann definitely isn't. You don't get a lot of genuine two-striker formations in real life. Again, think about how many you've actually seen. You see it more in Serie A. Maybe you get a lot of like 3-5-2s in that league, but I don't watch a lot of Serie A, and the teams I do watch tend not to be the two-striker formations anyway. I'm used to watching teams with wingers or teams with cams, and so there's a reason I like replicating that kind of style. Same with narrow formations. When's the last time you've actually seen somebody line up like this? Obviously, defensively, they won't be like that, but on offense, with the ball, they might. I think I've seen this once in real life. I think it was also an Arsenal game a while back, maybe in the Champions League, and there were a lot of injuries, had to do something creative, and you just end up with, I don't know, Santi Cazorla and Wilshere or something over here. Or Ozil is kind of a makeshift center. It was something strange. But again, I don't see a lot of formations like that, so I don't like replicating them. I'm used to seeing your various 4-3-3s and your 4-2-3-1. And not a lot of other formations. Again, you don't even see like 4-1-2-2 wides in real life or anything. But to get through my thoughts on all the formations here. So most of your 3-backs are going to be off limits by my eye, because I don't like the players I have to use for right mid and left mid. I'm fine with sacrificing the right back and left back as being kind of defensive and offensive players. But the right mid and left mid, I think I really just want attacking focused players here because of the expectation I'd have on them for providing so much on offense. But you have to use them somewhat defensively because you can't expect the center backs only to cover out wide. So there's just, it's not the right player selection. Again, I want as many players as I can have in my team that are like Neymar and Messi and Dybala and, Phil Foden's another really good body type, Ronaldinho, these kinds of players. You really can't afford to use them in situations like this. So the player selection is really limited. I also don't like selecting 3 different center backs. The center backs have to be somewhat tall to win your corners and physical and engagements and make your tackles and all of that. So already kind of limited by having 3 players here. As well as the 2 strikers, just not really something I'm interested in. This formation, the shape is okay as we get I don't like the flat 4 here. But the midfield 3 is theoretically the same 3 as my 4-3-3 holding. So you've got an okay shape to escape pressure, but you don't have a lot of great ability to get down the field. You'd have to have a false 9 here and have somebody drop off centrally. I think you're just really missing a central option. It's not like one of these players is going to be able to, especially this year with how the attacking AI is, they're not going to get into this space on their own, right? So you're missing a lot in the center. There's too much expectation on the wingbacks to be both defensive and offensive when I really want to include as many attacking players as possible. And the limitation of the 3 center backs, I think, is just kind of the big turn away from all the 3 backs for me. This one's one of the better shaped ones, I would say, because of the press resistance of the midfield. But I'm not going to be looking at actually using any of these. This is press resistant in the other way, kind of like my 4-3-3-4, where you can get down the field, but it's a little bit more direct focused. Again, we're going to be talking about that in the next video. But same issues. Don't really want the 2 strikers. Focus on the wide mids being too well-rounded. 3 center backs. And this one's even more defensive. At least in the other formation, we had these players you can include as your more attacking playmakers. I think here you just have to have them be a little bit more defensively minded without the security of a CDM behind them. Now here again, we're kind of really missing the central connection, which is a big thing for me. And you might think, again, this is what I'm obviously missing in my 4-3-3 holding, but the idea is the Fallstein tracker. Fallstein is a little bit harder when they're so closely surrounded immediately. The idea is this player drops off so that the winger can cut all the way across and occupy that space, which confuses the wingback of the opposition. You know, does the fullback cover, or does one of the center backs take up that role? When these players are already dedicated centrally, I don't think the false nine is quite as effective unless they're all able to pretty well rotate with each other. This guy drops off, this one maybe moves over here, and this one will underlap and then move up there. Which again, the creativity, you don't get this here, but that's what you'd try to look for. It's not like you'd also get the underlapping runs from the wide mids. These are kind of, again, this year really focused out wide. So we're just missing too much of a central connection, and there's not a great shape between your players of like progressing through. And the benefit of the 3 midfield with at least one player on either side is you've got the separation between your lines, so there's a little bit of depth. So it's harder to mark than if you're just that one flat line. If you've got the one little pivot, then they mark this guy, they're not marking these ones, there's a little more space. Or if they mark these ones, then somebody else drops off and you get a space to move up there. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'll be talking about that more. But yeah, when 2 midfield setups are always, or 2 central midfield are just really limited to me in the player selection and in the press resistance that they have. We'll talk about that a lot more when we actually get to the 4-4-2. The next 3 back here, 3-5-2. This is alongside the 3-1-4-2. Again, I should also mention with this one, been coded wrong in FIFA for a long time. Like, these players would always swap around or something. They never, I don't know about it this year, but in past years, they always coded this wrong. The 3-5-2, probably the most solid formation. You've got a bigger separation here than the 3-4-1-2, bigger gap between them, which in some ways just means a better pivot, further distance, which means a little bit better passing angles around. But again, the limitations, 2 strikers, wide mids, all that, not what I'm looking for. The CDMs, you have to have a little bit too defensive. Again, you want your Sissokos and your, I don't know, tall, kind of stocky and strong defenders here, which are not really the types of players I'm looking to have. And you don't have a lot of defensive strength from anybody else. And some 3 midfield setups, you don't have to use necessarily the strongest defenders in every situation because you've got really strong connections between 3 midfielders. Here, because of the distances between them, it's really hard to have like 2 more attacking CDM, more attacking focused midfielders here. These kind of have to be defensive because they're so far apart from each other. It's not like this one takes most of the responsibility away from that one. Now, in past years, we've had like people use a Bellingham here and then a Conte here, somebody way more defensively focused, and then just have this one get forward. And it works, but I don't like the asymmetry of it. Just personally, kind of aesthetically, I always like having as symmetrical of a formation as possible. But also, you're just limited by always going down one side of the field. Oh, all of my attacks are coming down here. Which means if your opponent is able to counter it, maybe they've got their stronger player on this side of the field or something, then it's just a little more nullified rather than always having an outlet on either side. That's the... Oh, we've got one more 3 back. Similar issues to the one with the cams here instead, obviously. You've got a little bit more separation between anybody, so hopefully you'd have some more creative runs being made because they're not already occupying somebody else's space. But honestly, now you've just got a bigger issue with separation between everybody. And these players are also kind of going to want to occupy the same spaces. So I think it's just kind of... like it's decent attacking focus if you just want to get down the wing and do your little cutbacks all the time. But, you know, again, I'm really not looking at using any of these. And I don't think I'd have any fun just aesthetically with a formation like this. 4 backs. Now, the 4-1-2-2 wide used to be good back in like FIFA 11 and 12, I think it was. Hasn't been good ever since, pretty much. A little bit too far connections away from everybody. Defensively, I think, is the main problem, though, where this shape just is not strong enough. You've got strong defensive connections here, and then just missing such massive gaps in the midfield where you're kind of just accepting defending with 5 players in some situations. Normally, you'd at least want to defend with 6. If not more. You know, the 4-4-2 in some situations defends with the 6 here, sometimes defends with 8, including what's out wide. My 4-3-3 holding would at least defend with 7 in most situations. I think here defending with the 5 is just too weak. But then even in build-up, like, you've got some strength here, but then it's really relying on the wide mids to come connect, and if they're just going to stay more or if they're not going to connect sometimes, they stay back a little bit too much, then all of a sudden you're really lacking in your ability to get everybody connected and have some interesting passing lanes. 4 and 2 and 2 narrow. Again, theoretically should line up like my 4-3-3 holding. These players maintain the width. You've got the ability to come back inside. These ones are all occupying the same situations or same locations that I want my other players to occupy in that formation. But because they start narrow, it just allows the defensive shape to stay so narrow against you. You want them starting a little bit wider so that you can cut inside into the gaps that are created by forcing them wide. And because they're just so narrow, you have to wait basically every attack for these players to give you the width. And then basically your outball is like this every time. I want to be able to sometimes attack through the middle, and the only through the middle is like doing one of these little give and goes. Otherwise, your opponent's going to be way too condensed here for you to be able to create anything through the center. You're just relying on 3 attackers pretty much exclusively to go against their entire defense until you get this to happen. Where you want a little bit more creativity from some of your players to get more involved. By having these ones so central all the time, it also kind of blocks the center mids from being able to get into those spaces. Sometimes if your winger, if these were wingers instead, if they're occupying a wider space, that does actually allow this player to make a run through the center instead in this little half space location. But because that space is always going to be occupied by one of the strikers, unless they roam wide, which this isn't, I want them cutting inside rather than moving wide to create space for a center mid. But unless they do that, then these players are pretty much limited from getting forward by just being blocked off up here. This is one Inception had a lot of success with. I don't like the central defense of it, where these two are just too much in a line. You want you want them kind of being next to each other. But that's kind of the one downside. You've got some creativity where this one can be a little bit more supportive or run forward. I think because you don't always have a cam occupying the space, maybe sometimes you get more creative runs. Or maybe if this guy's dropped off, that allows the left mid to make or one of the wide mids to make an underlapping run and occupy the space in the center. Sometimes you get a little bit more creativity because the spaces just aren't already in every situation preoccupied. But it's just not the shape that I actually want to attack in. Again, I'm looking at attacking not just with the 2 strikers because they're really central and kind of only occupying one space the whole time. I want them to be able to make more creative diagonal runs and pull the opposition apart rather than just kind of starting in a decent spot and moving from there. I want them to start from a technically less decent but more creative spot and then move into where they should. So not really one I would enjoy. Maybe it's one that's successful. Again, Inception really enjoyed this last year. I used it and I had success with it and didn't have fun with it. So, oops, as I knocked my controller over, my apologies. But yeah, it's just not aesthetically enjoyable for me, and that's the problem with a lot of these formations. I've also never seen this one in real life, so I just don't enjoy it that much. Now, a lot of people have said this formation, 4-1-4-1, is basically the same idea as my 4-3-3 holding, but might give me a little bit more success on defense if I'm defending with even more players rather than having the wingers always forward. And maybe just have better connections because I was having so many problems with the wingers getting in the spaces I actually wanted them to. Maybe I just have a more guaranteed passing outlet in every situation. I'd be technically even more press resistant by just having more players closer to hold onto the ball when I need to. The problem is I don't like flat lines. I like the depth to them. And the reason being, if I want to pass from the left mid to the center mid, my other center mid's in the way. Move it to this guy. It's really hard to get it to him unless he's already dropped all the way off in some way. So some of your passing lanes are just cut off by default, whereas if you had the depth to it, well, now I've got this pass and this pass that's not already occupied by somebody else being in the way. I mean, occasionally with the false 9 instruction you'd get that, but the point being, having that little bit more depth to it normally means you get more passing lanes. You get some actually better formed triangles, whereas here, you're just a little bit too disconnected from it's hard to call this one a connected triangle, because it's always kind of going to be blocked by this player. Whereas if we jump to the 4-3-3 holding real quick, here, it's not set up too well here on Footbin for what I'm trying to show, but a triangle like this, if the center mid's positioned this way a little bit more, which they normally are, is a more solid triangle to me than the one that's more focused like this, because that's not a flat line here. The flat line's more like here, but that gives more opportunity for these players to move wide of, you know, the other player there. And with the depth between everybody, anytime I pass back to somebody, it's encouraging the opposition, which might be in a shape like this, to extend out of that shape. Whereas if the triangle's like this, and they're in this shape, well, yeah, if they move back here, then they'll be encouraged to move out of that shape. But if I'm moving from this part of the triangle, like, nope. If I'm moving from this part to this part, they're not actually encouraged to move out of their shape at all. Or at least not depth-wise. They might width-wise, but not this way, right? When I'm looking here, any pass I make encourages them either this way or this way down the field. Like, no matter what, they're trying to, I'm trying to encourage my opponent out of their shape as much as possible. And that's just because of the depth and the distance between these players, while still maintaining a really strong triangle. It encourages the opponent to move out way more than it would in a situation like this. Now, obviously, as you move down the field, the idea is these players would be more attacking. But it's much harder for them to make this run normally than it is to make this run. Again, this here is a little bit different, but you will eventually maintain that shape that I was talking about that's more like this triangle in some situations. But even then, it's up to the attacking AI if this player is going to make that run first or if this player is going to make that run first. So I just like having the distances in the passing lanes with the actual depth between my lines, rather than having a more set, flatter line here. This is one that's been recommended to me a lot. This might be more defensively solid than my 4-3-3-4. The reason I don't like it is it's much harder to defend with a cam because there's so much more of a distance between these players. When we're looking at that 4-3-3-4, you know, you technically have more of a gap from your center mids to your defensive line than you would with the CDMs, but you've got a much more connected midfield that's more like this shape. Yeah. It's closer to a flat line. I don't want the flat line, but it's closer to one, which is a little easier to defend with than that shape, which just has such a bigger pocket here, which would take just much more time for the cam to come and get connected, and a lot of times the attacking AI, or the defensive AI is just not going to do that for you, so you've got to manually bring them back anyway. I just don't like the distances between the players. I understand that you think it's more defensively solid, or, you know, it may well be more defensively solid because these players are more dedicated defenders, but I just think there's too much of a distance between them for me to... I feel like in this situation, I'm defending with 6 instead of defending with 7. Even if it's a weaker 7, I like having the higher number on defense rather than the lower number. Even if these players are in more dedicated, kind of better defensive positions. I also just worry that the CDMs would be too disconnected from the rest of the attack. Now, we mentioned that maybe having less attackers is actually a benefit because it will maybe encourage the defense from the opponents to step out a little bit more and come step to you, create more distance between their lines. But I like having as many attackers as possible, and I feel like it's hard to have these players be really... have really good attacking stats because you're relying on the 6 defenders rather than the 7 up here. And because of the further distance, you know, there's not really good opportunities for them to dribble or anything, so they're just a little bit more a little too defensively focused for what I like to look for in information. 4-2-2 is one I used in FIFA 14, and not really since. It is fun. You get basically that 4-4-2, but instead of the flat lines, you get the depth that I'm talking about. So like triangle here is okay. That's a decent triangle shape. But then like this one's pretty weak, that shape there. And you're really lacking this one's also pretty weak. You're lacking the central connection that I really like having, because the cams are the types of players I really like using. That's another thing with the 4-1-4-1 actually. Is, again, if I'm using Neymar type players and they're a little bit more defensively focused, like Neymar and Messi as the wide players here, I don't necessarily want them in defensive situations all the time. Sometimes having them a little bit further forward will occupy the defense and make them question if they actually want to commit forward. So they perform a defensive action for me just by staying further down the field sometimes, rather than kind of encouraging the opposition out to me. But anyway... I would never use a 4-4-2. I would consider using 4-2-2 at times, just because, again, not the flat line, you get the depth to it. 4-4-2 would be 3 lines, whereas the 4-2-2, you can see we've got 4 lines instead. But I'm really missing that central connection, and I really don't like the 2 strikers because they're just kind of dedicated here. I want the cams to make more creative runs, but it's hard for them to get into these spaces when they're always going to be occupied by the strikers. And I think I'm really missing a good connection from the CDMs. Every time you've got the ball here, you're either going here or you're going to the striker. This pass might happen sometimes. This one's going to happen pretty rarely. So you've got some triangles, but not every possible outlet. And I think there's going to be such a distance between these players that it's hard to get them connected and really have this pass be effective to, do that one and go score. So it's very reliant on doing something creative with these players to open up space for the strikers. I think it's too reliant and too one-dimensional in that way. 4-2-3-1 is my most used ever formation in FIFA. It was the only one I could use from 17 to 23. I could not get any other formation to work consistently. I occasionally used a 3-5-2 and a 4-1-2-2 or a 4-1-2-2 narrow or 4-3-1-2. And those have been my only formations for the past couple of years until I found my 4-3-3 false 9 last year. 4-3-3 holding this year. So this is the one I have the most experience with by far. It's also one of the ones I've watched the most in real life. But it's got its own share of problems. The attacking wingbacks have never been effective in this formation, so I've always just had to accept just having the flat line on defense and attacking with these players. The CDMs, also in past years, you could program to be attacking, and the AI on them was really bad. So you're very heavily reliant on just attacking with 4 players. Now again, a lot of times that works, and the less players you commit forward, sometimes the less defenders the opponent commits back to defense. So sometimes it's okay to just attack with 4. It's not what I like, because again, in real life, it's very rare you see teams only attack with so many players. So it's so limited, but it definitely works as you get sometimes this cam a little bit dropping off. I wish the attacking AI was more creative again. You get some rotations being made here. But sometimes having them just be a little bit more, this one here. Sometimes this player will make runs to the side of the striker. Sometimes they'll just stay on the pivot here. And then the striker, slight variation, also being able to make those runs to the side, but normally down the center. I think it lacks a lot of creativity, but it gets your players in good pockets to be creative with. So what I mean is the passing lanes are very consistent. It's always going to be like this little pass here and try to go score. It's very kind of predictable in that way. But because of the spaces they occupy very consistently, it's very easy to attack with. I know where my players are going to be at pretty much all times. I might be lacking that creative attacking AI to go score for me, but I know where they're going to be, and if I just get them in decent enough positions, maybe a little bit dropped off away from the defensive line, just a little bit of a gap here, then I've got a really good dribbler here to just, take advantage of the little gap of space here and go score with, or do some creative dribble with and create some other opportunity. So I think it's really uncreative in some of its passing lanes and all of that, but the dribbling opportunities are normally pretty good. So I've liked using this, and it's been a great one for me to experiment with and learn a lot of my dribbling for the past couple of years. I think it's a very strong formation. It's not my favorite defensively, because you're normally getting 4 dedicated attackers with no defensive stats here, and then just kind of accepting 2 defending with 6 here. The pressing from these players isn't bad when you're able to press in that way, but once they get past that line, then you're just kind of accepting the defending with only these ones, which is sometimes okay. This year I find it even worse than in the past because there's such a great distance from CDM to central cam, which is a real shame. I'm finding it really hard this year to defend with just the 6. But hopefully that explains this one. This is definitely one of the 3 or 4 formations I always look to use in FIFA. It's not my favorite, but it is one of the guaranteed fallbacks, and normally I'm able to make it work well. And also, again, I get to watch it a lot in real life. This one, I've tried maybe once or twice, and I always just shy away from it. I like the central connections a little bit more. I think it's too reliant on just these players, and sometimes this guy will make more of these types of runs, which spaces out these runs from being made. Theoretically, if this works for you, if you do a lot of play down the wings, then this might be the one to go for you. But I really like attacking centrally at all times, so I'll always prefer the 4-2-3-1 over that one. This formation I hate. I know some teams that press in this formation in real life. Liverpool have done it sometimes as a prime example, or it's just, when the opponent has the ball somewhere like back here, it's just so hard to get the ball through this attacking line of 4, especially if you get kind of a more higher quality press, like a gegenpress of Liverpool with the the Klopp era. But you have to get some really hard workers to make this work, really hard runners, off the ball. But attackingly, it just seems like it should be so flat to me. I really don't like that as a shape. Again, you kind of get if I want to make this pass, normally it's going to be blocked off by this guy just being in the way. I also can't believe that a shape that has this much of a gap between everybody, like these players should be so far forward. I understand if this makes the opponents, commit less players from their own team to get down the field because they're worried that there's going to be such a counterattack threat. But the fact that, again, once you get by that, this should be so defensively weak. It's not this year. It actually works pretty well. It's never a formation I'm going to use because I've maybe seen Liverpool actually line up with this once. And even then, it's normally like Bobby Firmino here, who's a questionable, atypical striker anyway, more that false 9. So it ends up not even resembling the shape in most situations anyway, but it's unrealistic of a formation in my mind, and I can't imagine using it because of that. 4-3-1-2 I think is exactly the same as everything I would have covered with the 4-2-2 narrow. I like this one more because you get the little bit of drop-off depth there, so it's a little bit more press resistant as we've been talking about because you've got the pivot with a little bit of depth. But sometimes this one's just programmed better. It's really just try them both out and see which, if the center mid instructions work better than the CDM. Sometimes you might think keeping a flat line is a little bit easier to defend with than the pivot. I normally prefer the pivot to defend with, but some people like the flat line. It's a little bit easier to maintain. This one I don't want to use on principle because it's been the only formation everybody else has played for the past 3 years, and I used to use it back in FIFA 16, some in 17. It's normally one I try out every year just because, again, the players are in the positions I want them to be. I prefer that with the creativity, but this is the shape I about want them to end up in at the end. So I normally try it out every year, and then I just haven't the past 2 or 3 years because everybody else has used it. Now that people aren't using it, I actually did try it out this year, and cams are really poorly programmed this year because the Shadow Striker instruction means they really push forward and then get on the opponent's back line and then just kind of stay here, and they'll get to the spot, and one of the defenders is here, they'll get here, and then just kind of be stuck behind them and make these little movements that are they never are able to be passed to. And then there's the playmaker instruction that keeps them deeper away from the opponent's line. Theoretically more of a passing lane, and it, again, never works for me. They're just too occupied by the opponent's midfield line normally. So the programming of the cams, I think, is just really bad this year, unfortunately. Some people are getting this to work. I don't mind it as a shape, theoretically. I just hate using it when it's meta. Now that it's not meta, I don't mind it, but I prefer the little bit of a pivot with the midfield, and these players sometimes occupy a little bit too close to the same position, sometimes they're a little bit too flat of a line, and it's always, for me, really reliant on these players bombing all the way down the field, where because it's a narrow formation, it's just too hard to get through the opponent centrally. It just encourages them to be too compact on defense, which means I'm kind of ball here, ball here, ball here, just waiting. This player makes this run, another little pass, he made it this far down the field, another little pass, not really able to do anything until eventually this is my out ball. And I don't want to rely on this every single time. I at least want some ability to go down the middle. Even though this looks like it's solid down the middle, it just encourages the opponent to be too condensed. 4-3-3 flat, I'm not going to talk about too much because it's really similar to this one, but I just prefer it with the drop-off of the CDM. I think it's, again, it might be a little bit easier for some to defend with. For me, it's not, because I prefer the little bit of creativity allowed with the drop-off CDM rather than the kind of basic stability of a flat line. But the other problem here is sometimes this player will be the one coded to make runs forward, especially because, when you get the cams here, I think the space is a little bit blocked off and this player doesn't really roam forward. But if there's a little bit of space allowed up here, sometimes this player will be prioritized to move forward rather than the other center mids. And I just prefer these players getting into those spaces instead. You really want at least one defensive player centrally to maintain a solid shape. This one I think I've talked about enough. Maybe the formation I've watched the most in real life. Definitely my favorite teams that I've watched have used this formation. Particularly the false 9, which has been, like very rarely used in real life, you can say, but that 2011 Barca side, it was, anyway. But yeah, this accomplishes basically these players getting wide, forcing these players inside, which means they're getting into the shape I want eventually, at the right times, in the past year, not this year, but in past years. And encouraging the opponent to stay a little bit wider, then forcing them to condense, but even if they do condense, I've got the ability to go wide anyway. These players can be attacking, they can be defensive. There's a lot of creativity with who occupies what role at what time. And then this player dropping off, sometimes they'll make late runs, which are pretty effective if they come from deep. But dropping off also means this player can come over and occupy that space. Doesn't quite work out that well this year. Again, I'm going to try to make this one work, but I'm just a little frustrated by how they've coded everything. That might be an upcoming rant, by the way. Let me know if you want to hear that, how frustrated I am with the role system. I've taken away a lot of creativity and a lot of ability for the players to make their own decisions. In past years, they wouldn't just be a shadow striker or a playmaker cam. They'd be able to do both depending on the situation. And this year, they're just way limited by only ever being one of those options. I don't think I'll talk about this one either because it's just very similar to the 4-3-3-4, but I think there's just too big of a gap between these players to really have a successful transition to offense most of the time. Everything else is going to be similar to the 4-3-3-4, so we'll just talk about that one instead. The only time I've actually used this formation was once with FIFA 17, and I had a once-to-watch Felipe Anderson, who was really successful out here. And just, like, it was a good counter-attacking formation, but there was never any ability to get the ball down the field and then reconnect back with these players. They're just so slow to actually move up the field with you. This one we'll talk about more tomorrow. The idea was defensively it should be a little bit of a shield. So it's like, yes, it's dangerous if the opponents were able to get in behind in this position. But normally when the ball's behind, they're just deflected and forced out wide from that shape. And then the idea was similar idea to the 4-3-3 holding, but have the pivot on the other side. Hopefully that allowed me to be more attacking. But I think it just allowed the opponents to condense up a little bit too much, and I didn't have any ability to get through the opponent's shape. 4-1-2-1-2 second variation, or excuse me, 4-4-1-1 second variation. I've always found this player to be really coded poorly because the striker is normally occupying that space instead. So you're just kind of waiting for one of these runs to be made, which is normally not that effective when you're not having somebody else occupy these spaces. And because you're not always having somebody in the more attacking zones, then you're really reliant on just these two as attackers. I think it's just too weak offensively, trying to get the ball to these two from this situation every opportunity. And if you have the center mids commit too far forward, then they're occupying that space, can't allow anybody else to get into it, and then you're leaving a big gap on defense. I hate this formation. It's the most basic formation. I'm like, as a defensive shape, a lot of teams defend in a 4-4-2. That makes sense. I'm okay with it defensively. Not how it's programmed in game, obviously, but I'm okay with teams like resorting to it on defense, theoretically. Again, a lot of teams in real life do that. That's fine. This was the history of football. Most teams used a 4-4-2 for the longest time, and then 4-3-3s became most popular and all that kind of stuff. I don't mind it like as its existence, but I just hate that a shape that should be so simple, so predictable, and so easy to defend is one of the most popular ones. I just wish also some of the opponents had a little bit more creativity that I play. It's really boring to just face the same counterattack every single time. Like, you ever play one of those players that it's like, yes, I know you've got Vinicius Jr. out here. I'm really tired that your entire game has been going this way and nothing else. Like, I know you've got Adama out here who's not as strong as Vinicius. Attack down the right ones, please. I'm just bored of defending the same thing every time. So I'm just a little bit frustrated by it because of that. The main downside to this one, I think, is the center mids are, again, the players I want to use are sometimes your Odegaard, sometimes your Rafa Guerreros. It does depend, but I want your shorter, more creative players. You know, the higher the defensive stat, the better. That's okay. But I want them to be attacking focused as well. Really get on the ball, great with dribbling and passing. The shooting's not as important, but like those are the players I want. And because of the distance these ones have to cover, they're basically involved in everything up here. You can't have, like, the player selection isn't what I actually want. You're forced to use your taller players, your more defensive players. Normally these players are really expensive too. You think you're like Bellingham special cards, your Hullets and Zidans and, you know, whatever those cards are. But there's just such a gap between them, and it's so hard to make connections, which means every attack is basically down the wing, cut back across, you know, this is your little shot, or one more cut back, and then there's your shot. So predictable on offense. I wouldn't have any fun using it. I'm not even going to bother trying it. Again, with most of these formations, I'm not. But hopefully that explains why I just dislike this one a lot. I also like my attacking wingbacks, which a lot of times when you have the wide mids, it actually kind of prevents that from happening most of the time anyway. So this has been covered by everything else. This one's more closer to the 4-2-2 anyway. But a little bit more, it's not a flat shape, but it's closer to a flat shape than the 4-2-2. And I've covered everything else about why I wouldn't like this one. Now this one actually does kind of get to the shape I want. Like, you could do the false backs, and this would turn into my 4-3-3 holding, where these ones would move here. Now that's kind of the shape I want with the midfield pivot like that. They'd be a little further forward. So that would theoretically create my midfield 3. This one, these two maintain the width like the fullbacks normally would in my other formation, which means you've got your 2 players out wide, 2 players in the attacking half space, your 1 striker here, maybe can drop off, and then you've got your midfield pivot. But defensively, no. There's too much of a gap between these players, and you don't want these to be programmed, or you don't want to select defensive players for these situations anyway. Again, I want my Neymars and Messis here. Which means your shape is just way too wide. There's too much of a gap here. Defensively, it's just not going to work. Attacking can be creative. I got this to work once in FIFA 16, I think it was, with like a 20k squad at Christmas. That was really fun, actually. But that's been the only time I've actually been able to make it work. Every other time it's too defensively unsolid. This one, everything I don't like about it has been covered by the fact I don't like flat lines. Eventually, you might progress down the field and they become not flat. But again, like, your attacking wingbacks are going to be cut off there. It takes too long for these players to move into the space here. Sometimes these players will move up, which would not be what I want. And then these players or these players are blocked off from moving inside anyway. Which means a lot of times, at least when, like, if you're very consistently have this player making this run inside, then at least you've got some pretty consistent passing lanes to get out of it. If this player moves all the way up, sometimes this pass is a lot harder to make. But yeah, flat line, not a fan of. 5 backs, I'm not going to talk about. A lot of this is down to player selection. I don't want to have, again, the right back and the left back be defensively focused players. I want to put as many attackers, you know, small, good dribblers on the ball, small and good dribblers on the field as possible. But also these are ratty, and I just don't enjoy them, and I don't watch 5 backs in real life. I also try not to make my opponent feel too much like they want to hate me when I play against them. I guess I have some moral code of ethics with what I do in game. Same idea of like trying not to score long shot Trivellas every game or flick up power shot volleys. It's not fun for me, and I know the opponent's sitting on the other end going, I hate this. At least sometimes if I score a skill run, it's like, oh, well, that was a decent goal to concede, right? But no, I just won't. Like, morally, I won't. It doesn't allow me to put the players on the field that I want. I could go through and explain why the shapes aren't what I want, but I don't think that's actually worth it. I don't want to spend that much time even talking about 5 backs. I'm actually realizing now that I forgot to talk about player selection for a lot of these. That was the other main point of all of this. So some of these you might understand, like, yeah, I can put my more creative center mids here because I've got a decent defensive shape as it is. So I can have, you know, I don't have to use 3 CDMs here or anything. Same idea with the 4-3-3 holding. I can have some more creative midfielders out there. But a lot of the 2 center mid formations then will restrict that, and I've got to use really defensive players there. And I think the 4-3-1-2, because it's so narrow, that you don't have any coverage out wide. Means if your opponent ends up attacking out wide a lot, I might want slightly better defenders here to be able to cover all of that distance. You know, when that movement happens, then this player has to shift over, and this one has to shift over, which means I might want better defensive stats here. It's a lot harder to defend out wide when you don't have the dedicated winger, or you'd have to bring this player all the way over. But yeah, think about in a lot of these, for me, like this one here, you can have your 4 decent attackers, but you also want these to be defensively decent enough. Because of the distances some of these are covering, it's also worth mentioning, it's better here to have your Viniciuses and your Damas and maybe Hansen, because she's pretty fast. But you can't really have like your early Messi cards and your Neymars, because they're just slower players at this time. You don't really want like Dybala out here, because again, he's like 80 pace. You want your 90 plus pace players here. At least with a formation like this, yeah, it's like it can be transitional and you want some faster players, but it also allows me to get some slower players on the field. Same thing with this one. When it's very central and it's in the right shape for me to attack with, I can be afforded to have a lot of slow players. But if I'm relying on these players for the transition and getting wide a lot, then these players need to be a little bit faster. So sometimes it really depends on the player selection too, of what these formations are allowing me to put on the field in terms of who I actually want to use. Anyway, that was a bit of a longer video than I expected. I do hope you enjoyed. It's maybe a bit of a ramble, but I know a lot of you have enjoyed some of the more in-depth content. If you do have any more specific questions about these formations, maybe something I didn't cover, or maybe something you disagree with, maybe you think one of these formations is more creative than I'm saying it is, or you know, maybe you can use it in a different way than I'm thinking, please do let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this type of video, let me know. I'll maybe try to put out some more in-depth tactical, maybe kind of real-life shape form of formations videos like this, if that makes sense. But yeah, anyway, at the end of this, a little bit of a ramble. Hope you enjoyed though. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.